Hello there, welcome to another Top 9 list. As you can tell, I'm a huge Apple fan, but they did make some bad products out there. From low-end pieces of crap to commercial failures, this list is for the worst products that Apple has ever made. Today, we're going to be looking at 9 of the worst Apple products. Let's get started. Number 9, Retina MacBook. The last MacBook was discontinued in 2012, so Apple hasn't made a new MacBook model for a long time. When the new MacBook was announced, it was quite promising. And when it was finally released in April of 2015, it wasn't as good as we thought it was. The main problem with the new MacBook is that it's underpowered and overpriced compared to the MacBook Air. Oh, and just like with any new Apple laptop computer, it didn't come with a built-in disk drive. The reason why I'm putting the new MacBook low on the list is because, despite its problems, it's still a fine-looking machine and it's not as bad as the other Apple products on this list. Number 8, the Performa X200 computers. The Macintosh Performa line was Apple's first attempt to sell computers in retail stores. It wasn't very successful, and the entire Performa line was discontinued when Steve Jobs returned to Apple. I couldn't choose all the Performa computers at once. I only had to pick one. And this mention goes to the Macintosh Performa 5200 and 6200. I was going to choose the Macintosh Performa 6400 and 6500, but I chose these computers instead, and here's why. While the Macintosh Performa 6400 and 6500 suck at playing mid-90s Mac games, especially SimCity 2000, the Macintosh Performa 5200 and 6200 are far worse. These computers use the same exact logic board as the Macintosh Quadra 630, aka the LC 630, and the Performa 630. On the Quadra 630, it made sense, considering, well, that it's a Motorola 68040 chip. It's also good if you can't afford to buy the Macintosh Quadra 800 or even the Quadra 700, and you just want to play Mac games on a 68040 based Mac. On the Performa 5200 and 6200, it's a 64-bit PowerPC chip on a 32-bit logic board. That means that it limits the performance and makes it slower than any of the other PowerPC based Macs. The Performa 5200 and 6200 are so bad that it was the reason why a lot of people believed that Macs are slower than Windows PCs for a long time. Now that is unacceptable. Number 7, the 20th Anniversary Macintosh. The 20th Anniversary Macintosh, aka the TAM, was made to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Macintosh computer. It was the first Macintosh computer to use a built-in LCD screen, but it wasn't very successful. It was way too expensive and had the same specs as a Power Macintosh 5500 that you could be buying for far less. Its Bose speakers that it came with looked like a trash can. I'm using that in quotations, by the way. But it did have the unique startup chime, though. When the price of the TAM was lowered, it gained a cult following and even made way for the iMac G4, iMac G5, and later iMac computers. So at least something good has come out of this computer. Number 6, Apple Free. The Apple III was the first computer made by Apple that was aimed to more business-friendly markets. I'm using that in quotations, by the way, because I don't think this computer would do well against the IBM PC, which was a very good machine, by the way. But it failed miserably. The reason why it failed is because of its high price point and its reliability issues. Its reliability issues led to many recalls, and instead of using the Apple DOS, which was standard on many Apple II machines, it used the Apple SOS. Even though it was more advanced than the regular Apple DOS, it also meant that you couldn't use the Apple II applications on it. Only get this computer if you're a hardcore Apple collector. Number 5. Apple Lisa. The Apple Lisa was the first computer that was made by Apple to use a graphical user interface. Pretty cool, isn't it? Since, well, most computers at the time had key commands. When it was released, it was by no doubt a failure. It was way too expensive because it costed nearly $10,000 when it first came out. Holy cow! And it was too slow. The only major user of this computer was NASA, of all things. Probably because they're the only kinds of people who can afford to buy this computer. The Macintosh 128K came out a year after this computer, and it sold better because it was a better computer despite its flaws. Number 4. Macintosh Portable. Even though the Macintosh Portable was bad, it was the first Apple laptop computer that Apple has ever made. The Macintosh Portable was heavy, but keep in mind that this was a time when laptop computers were big and heavy. They were so heavy that business users on the go didn't want to carry that big thing around all the time. However, this was made at a time when these big hulking behemoths are obsolete and were being replaced with more modern style laptops. Just like many Apple products on this list, it was too expensive and was full of problems. For instance, if the battery no longer held a charge, that meant it could not run on the power adapter. That's a bad sign right there. There was also issues with the hard drive, and it was rendered unreadable in low light situations because it didn't have a backlight. Apple later introduced a backlit model that fixed these problems of it being unreadable in low light situations. Thankfully, Apple followed suit with the other laptop manufacturers and replaced this computer with the PowerBook 140, PowerBook 170, and even the good old PowerBook 100. The PowerBook 100 had the same internals as the Macintosh Portable, but it was much better. I highly recommend getting the PowerBook 100, not just for Apple collectors, but for fans of retro computers, because it is just great. Number 3. Apple Bandai Pippin. Apple fans wanted to see Apple make a video game console, and yes, Apple did indeed make a video game console. The Apple Bandai Pippin was marketed as a CD-based multimedia platform but failed miserably. Even though it was faster than the other consoles released at the time because it had a 66 MHz PowerPC processor, compared to the PlayStation's 33 MHz processor and the Sega Saturn's 228 MHz Hitachi processors, but was slower than the Nintendo 64 with its 93 MHz NEC VR4300 processor. It was more expensive than the PlayStation, Nintendo 64, and the Sega Saturn, and only had a handful of games supporting it, although there are more games released for it in Japan. The only good games on the Pippin include the Journeyman Project, Pegasus Prime, Shockwave, Invasion Earth, 2019, and Super Marathon, all of which you can already get on the Macintosh. It was basically just a Macintosh computer made into the form of a video game console. And you can even see the Macintosh menu on some Pippin games. If you wanted to play games on the Macintosh, just get a Macintosh computer. Get a Power Mac, G-Free Beige, or one of the high-end PowerPC based Macs. Don't get a Pippin. Number 2. All of the Apple Newton models except for the eMate 300. The Apple Newton message pad was very revolutionary for the time, but it was also the subject of many jokes. Most notably, a segment in The Simpsons where someone writes, "Beat up Martin," but it comes up as "Eat up Martha" instead. The handwriting recognition wasn't very good, but I've seen worse though. And the first model had very poor battery life because it took triple A's, but the later models took double A's and had much better battery life. The only good Newton model is the Apple eMate 300, just because it was so unique and was ahead of its time, because keep in mind, it was made before we had those laptops, PCs with touchscreens. And no, in case you're wondering, I'm not familiar with them at all. Call me old-fashioned if you will, but I prefer my laptops to have touchpads or trackballs instead of those touchscreens, because I'm used to laptops with touchpads and trackballs. The entire Newton line was discontinued when Steve Jobs returned to Apple, even though the Newton message pad was a failure. It made way for the Palm handheld devices and even the iPod Touch. Yes, this failure led to the iPod Touch. So, without the Newton message pad, we wouldn't get the iPod Touch. So there you go. Before we take a look at the worst Apple product of all time, let's take a look at some honorable mentions, ones that didn't make it onto the list for obvious reasons. Power Macintosh 6400 and 6500. As I said before, these computers are terrible for playing mid-90s Macintosh games, including SimCity 2000. Even though they have a powerful enough CPU, they can only be upgraded to 136 megabytes or 128 megabytes depending on the model, which makes it slower than the high-end PowerPC based Macs, or even the Power Macintosh 6100. I was going to put these computers on the list, but I decided to put the Macintosh Performer 5200 and 6200 on the list instead. Macintosh Quadra 630, also known as the LC 630 and the Performance 630. The Quadra 630 is a bad computer, despite the fact that it has an IDE drive. It was pretty good for a Motorola 6040 based Mac, and was good for playing Mac games that didn't require a PowerPC chip. For those of you who can't afford to buy a Macintosh Quadra 800 or 700, I highly recommend you to buy this computer. And it even has a DOS compatible model for playing DOS games if you didn't already own a DOS computer. Thumbs up right there. Macintosh 128K. The Macintosh 128K was the first of the Macintosh computers, but it's not the best. It was the first mainstream computer to use a graphical interface and made way for the computers that we use today. Because it only has 128K of memory, there aren't that many games that you can play on it, and the Macintosh 512K can only run System 4.1, which means that both the Mac 128K and 512K limit your options on games. Despite its flaws, it's still a pretty good machine for Mac collectors. However, if you want to play games, I recommend you getting a Macintosh Plus or even a Macintosh SC. PowerBook 5300. The PowerBook 5300 had numerous faults and was infamous for catching fire because of the kind of batteries it was using. It was the first of the Apple laptop computers to use a PowerPC chip and had a hot swappable drive bay, but it wasn't big enough to fit a CD-ROM drive, and CD was just becoming popular. Instead, you had to attach an external CD-ROM drive if you wanted to use a CD with it. It wasn't bad enough to make it onto the list, and there are far worse computers that Apple has made. This one is for collectors only. If you want a good PowerPC based PowerBook that was made before the PowerBook G4, I'd recommend you getting a PowerBook G3 instead. PowerMac G4 Cube. The PowerMac G4 Cube did have its flaws. It was slightly more expensive than the PowerMac G4 Tower. It didn't offer much for expandability and was by no doubt a flop. With its flaws, it's still a pretty good machine. It had unique looks, it was great for playing Warcraft free, and it's a good computer for Macintosh collectors and enthusiasts. The reason why this computer didn't make it onto the list is because it just wasn't that bad, despite its flaws. And the worst Apple product is the Puck Mouse. It was awkward to use and made you want to buy a third-party mouse instead. Nah, just kidding. In truth, the worst Apple product is the Macintosh TV. To be fair, the Macintosh TV was a good idea. It was a computer that combined the functionality of a TV. However, the execution was poor, it was overpriced, and can only be upgraded to 8 megabytes of memory. Even for 1993, that was pretty low. And it's also pretty low even compared to the Macintosh LC520, which was the computer that it's based on, and the Macintosh Color Classic. It was also incapable of showing TV in a desktop window. However, it can still capture frames to picked files. Only 10,000 of these computers were made. And I probably see why. Heck, you can even buy an Apple TV / video system card for less and attach it to whatever kind of Macintosh computer you own. While this computer is by no doubt a piece of junk, it definitely made way for the Director's Edition Power Macs, the built-in TV tuner function of some Macs, and the Apple TV. So, that was the list for the worst Apple products. Now, you might want to ask, well, why can't you do a list for the best Apple products? Well, you want to know the reason to that? Well, it's because there's just too many of them to count. Yeah, there's a lot of good products that Apple has made, like the iMac G3, the eMac, which is the computer right there, the iBook G3 clamshell, the good old PowerBook G4, the Power Mac 9500, the Power Mac G3 blue and white, and the list can go on from there because there's just so many good Apple products. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the Advent Calendar videos.